Today we are marking the 250th birthday of Jane Austen, which is strange because Gilbert White and Jane Austen never met, and despite the fact that they only lived a couple of miles from each other, we have very, very little evidence that the Austens and the White family ever came into contact, and certainly Jane and Gilbert never met. However, I believe that when we look closely into their lives, little connections start popping up, and so I thought we'd just do a little video just to point out some of the connections between Gilbert White and his neighbour, Jane Austen. The biggest difference between Jane Austen and Gilbert White is that they were from different generations. Gilbert White was born in 1720, and obviously as we're celebrating the 250th anniversary, Jane Austen was born in 1775. Gilbert White could have been her grandfather. One of the early similarities between their lives is that they both grew up in rural Hampshire in big families. So they would have had the calm and the serenity of the outdoors on their doorstep, but the house would have been full of noise, laughter, and learning. Gilbert White was the eldest of 8 children, whereas Jane Austen was the second youngest and the youngest girl. So they would have had very different roles within the household, but I think they probably, had they ever met, have a lot of things in common in how they were brought up. They are both writers that had a real sense of place, and this landscape that both Selborne and Chawton sit in, they're only 4 miles away from each other, was hugely important to them as writers. Obviously Gilbert White wrote the Natural History of Selborne, a book that we know that the Austens owned, and was very much inspired to write because of the landscape around him. But Jane Austen was the most proactive in her writing career while she was living in Chawton too, and it's the sense of place and landscape in her novels and in Gilbert White's writing that comes through, that really links them to one as a writer of fiction and one as a writer of non-fiction. Gilbert White was a clergyman, and that is something that Jane Austen knew a lot about. She was the daughter of a clergyman, and if there was ever a link to surface linking the two families together, one day I hope we find some evidence that Gilbert White came into contact with George Austen, Jane Austen's father. They were both clergymen working in the county of Hampshire, and although they were different ages and different areas, I'd like to hope that maybe they knew of each other at least and rubbed shoulders occasionally. Although there are many connections between the Austens and the Whites that we don't have, there are some connections between these two families, bearing in mind that the Whites still lived in the Selborne area way into Jane Austen's lifetime and beyond it. The closest connection to Gilbert White was his nephew Jack. Now, here at Gilbert White's house, we know Jack as this teenage boy who's come to Hampshire for his education. Gilbert has taken him under his wing. Lots of letters back to John, Jack's father, about how tall he's getting, what he's reading, how his education is going, and what they're going to do about his career. The career that Jack chooses is to become a physician. He becomes a doctor, and he pops up many, many years later in a letter from Jane Austen to her sister Cassandra, where she mentions that the Dr. John White had come to visit her. It's a very, very tongue-in-cheek reference to a man who by this point was well into middle age and much older than Austen and her sister, and was not there to give medical attention to anyone, was simply there, I think, to sit in a house of ladies and Jane Austen knew exactly what he was about, but Jack, as we knew him as a young man, was probably the nearest person that Gilbert had in his life to a son. And when Gilbert White died, it was Jack who was sent for to attend his bedside, and not just in a medical way, but as his next of kin. So there is a wonderful symmetry in Gilbert White by recording the birth of his niece Jane Clemence's 9th child, and then in 1811 Jane Austen, in a letter, does the same for the next generation down. So along the road from the cottage that the Austens lived in is Proutings, and both families knew the Prouting family, so that is another link. You have references to Mr. Prouting in Gilbert White's letters. These are families that both the Whites and the Austens would have known really, really well. And remembering that Gilbert White used to preach in Chawton Church when he was needed, so would have known the congregation of Chawton really well, and only a decade or so before the Austens moved to the village, so they would have known the same people, the same faces, and the people of Chawton would have remembered Gilbert White very well, probably as the man who liked to recycle his sermons. But I think the thing that really, really binds these two authors together is that the way they wrote and the way they looked at the world. There is a really well-known quote of Austen's where she describes the way that she writes as working on a small piece of ivory 2 inches wide, on which she works with so fine a brush. What she's saying there is that she concentrates on the small, on a couple of families in a small village, but in doing so is reflecting society as a whole. She's reflecting on how the world works and how people interact with each other on a wider level, but concentrating on the very small. And this is exactly what Gilbert White does when he writes about the natural world. We use the phrase that he mentions as well, watching narrowly, where he would zoom down on the minutiae of nature, looking so closely at how one insect or one bird or one plant behaves, and by doing that deducing the wider ecology of the natural world. And they're doing the same things once again, but just one with society and fiction, and the other with ecology and non-fiction. And we know that the Austens read Gilbert White, and who knows, it could have been an inspiration for Jane Austen in the way that she thought about the nature of people, in the same way that Gilbert White thought about the nature of the landscape around him. So happy birthday, Jane Austen. We will be celebrating here in our own small way next door in Selborne.